I'm Alice Mackenzie, and welcome to Must Reads. Today, our guest is Dr. Jared Alcántara. Dr. Alcántara is Associate Professor of Preaching and holds the Paul W. Powell Endowed Chair of Preaching at George W. Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, a fellow Texan. So welcome, Dr. Alcántara.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mackenzie. It's great to be with you, and it's a joy to see you again, and thanks for having me.
Certainly. So Dr. Alcántara is an ordained Baptist minister, and his special interests are in the preaching of African-American pulpit prince Gardner Taylor, about which he's written a book called Crossover Preaching in 2015. He's also interested in Latinx and African-American preaching contexts. His latest book is entitled The Practices of Christian Preaching, Essentials for Effective Proclamation, published by Baker Academic Press in 2019, and just this week it hit the shelves, translated into Spanish. Do I have that right?
That's right. That's right. That was the vision way back when the project was conceived, was that it would be available to English language speakers and Spanish language speakers, so that it would have a reach beyond the U.S. and then also have a reach in classrooms where for students who Spanish is their first language, if they're taking a class in English, they could read the book in Spanish.
Wonderful. That's great news. So the book is organized around 5 deliberative practices. I love the 5 C's because I also love alliteration. And they are preach convictionally, preach contextually, clearly, concretely, and creatively. So the book also describes or provides some learning activities and sermon samples on an accompanying website. So the book, as I mentioned, is about deliberative practices. What's the difference between just a practice and a deliberative practice?
That's a great question. Yes, as I was preparing for the book and doing research into a practice way of thinking about preaching, I really got into some interesting work by someone named K. Anders Ericsson. He and some of his fellow researchers coined the term deliberate practice, in which they talk about the difference between reflective, strategic, goal-oriented growth mindset practice and regular practice. One of the points that they make is that, that Anderson and others make, is that just because you've been doing something for a long time doesn't necessarily mean that you're better at it. So a doctor who's been a doctor for 20 years might not be better than a doctor who's been a doctor for 10. So much of it has to do with how you go about the practice itself, whether that's dance or medicine or driving or preaching. So people who commit themselves to deliberate practice, according to Ericsson and others, ascribe to 4 commitments. And so the first commitment is setting concrete goals for growth. The second one is focused attention, which is a certain attenuation to the event as it's taking place and one's own kind of attentiveness in the moment. The third one is a willingness to take risks. To push yourself, to stretch yourself beyond your comfort levels. And then the fourth one is constructive feedback. So having feedback loops in place that enable and empower you to kind of go beyond that level of automaticity that could lead to diminishing returns. So that's their point, is that automaticity can set in and there can be diminished outcomes as a result. So deliberate practice when it comes to preaching is having that growth mindset, setting goals, taking risks, having focused attention, having feedback loops that enable and empower you to have a growth mindset over time.
So let's jump into those 5 practices. What
Sure.
would be a sort of key important thing for people to note about each one?
Yeah, well, the reason why I wanted to go about it this way was I had read different preaching textbooks as I was in seminary and then into my PhD program. And I didn't want to write a book that was that sounded like noise, like it was just one other book on and that it was an introduction to preaching textbook that sounded just like everything else. And so I had really gotten excited about thinking about preaching in these terms. Many of the books that I had read previously, not all books are this way, but many of the books that I had read previously were much more focused on method. And it was very much a single voice and not necessarily a collaboration with other voices. And there was much more of a focus on a particular philosophy or style or form. And so I wanted to make that shift to practice. And so something more practice oriented, not just univocal, but plurivocal. And then with these practices, thinking about it as these are habits or deliberative practices that we can cultivate over time that will inevitably shape our growth as preachers. So I came up with the 5: preach convictionally, preach textually, preach clearly, preach concretely, preach creatively. You could kind of think about them like buckets or categories into which we could put different things, like the ways that we illustrate, the ways that we apply, the ways that we communicate, the ways that we preach in a particular time and place, the ways that we do storytelling, poetics, language, accessibility, all the things that we normally think about with preaching. With these particular practices, I felt like these were buckets that we could put some of those conversations into that are easy to remember. So that is important when teaching students, how can I remember these? That's right. And that we could focus on that could inevitably apply to every sermon. How is my sermon contextual? Is it clear? Is it creative? Is there a convictional aspect where I believe what I'm preaching? Is there a creative piece? The concrete pieces of illustrating and applying, of bringing it to real people in a real particular point in time. All of those, I think, should be on our minds in every sermon. So just helping familiarize people with the questions to ask, right, but also setting them on a trajectory over time toward their growth. So those were the 5. And then I don't need to go into it too much yet, but the linchpin for me is another C, which we could talk about if you like.
Well, I noticed in the graphic in the book, you've got a circle and got them all around. And then in the middle, it's preach a Christian sermon. And I take that to mean that this book is not just about how to preach, but it is about why and what. And I appreciated that. So the preaching the Christian sermon, it seems like that's a very clear sense that the gospel is an announcement and a call, right? And so
yes,
we've got to have that at the center, or all the how-tos, fall away.
Right. And part of what I was trying to pay attention to is there's this old saying that one of the more dangerous things about preaching is that it can be taught, right? So if we're leading people astray, if we're even unintentionally crushing people with what's supposed to be good news, if we're explaining and not proclaiming, right, if we are caught up in a certain way of thinking that ends up communicating to people that there's not this invitation, this call, this opportunity. I think of a Tom Long line where he says, the gospel is, you don't have to live this way anymore, that Jesus is making this announcement to the people in his proclamation in the Gospels. So that's what I'm getting at there, is that the other C's don't really matter if we don't preach recognizably Christian sermons that announce, that proclaim, that offer good news to people, that recognize that there are real problems, real struggles, that there are real reasons for lament, but also juxtaposing lament with this call to hope.
Well, so if you had to summarize, what would be your hope? Maybe one key hope that you would have that this book would offer to preachers in this difficult time to preach?
That's a great question. One of my hopes, I would say, is that this book would be life-giving. And that's the goal, is that something that is a practice that we do as preachers, that we want to do as ministry to people, that it would be life-giving to them and life-giving to us. And so that's the idea, is that these habits, these practices are life-giving practices that we can cultivate over time. And it's not just about a how-to, it's about a why. It's not just about ways to get better, but how to grow in our interior practices, in our exterior practices. I focus on that with preaching convictionally. There are habits that are temptations that we should avoid. There are also life-giving habits that we should pursue. So I would say, especially during a particular difficult time, I would hope that a resource like this would be life-giving to those who preach and give them a sense of hope and expectation that there are opportunities moving forward in their growth and that people will benefit as a result and be blessed as a result.
That's great. Well, I certainly benefited from reading the book, and I want to thank you for this practical and profound guide to, as you say, not just the how-to, but the what and the why of preaching. So thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Dr. McKenzie. It's a joy to be with you and great to see you again.
Take care.